Well, let's focus in on one of our politicians, and that's Ben Wallace, who's been talking at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Let's have a listen to what he was talking about.
Let us move on to the substantive issues of NATO and what is happening in Ukraine. I suppose the one thing that has happened that, I think it was Emmanuel Macron who was saying that NATO was brain dead, and no one would say that now. It's found its reason to be in a way that was unimaginable prior to the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. Is NATO in a stronger position? And we hear about the fraying of NATO unity. What is more remarkable in your mind, the fraying or the extent of the unity?
Well, first of all, NATO has worked. Throughout this war, an ever more aggressive President Putin with constant threatening red lines that usually then melt away, he hasn't dared go near NATO. Russia has been very, very cautious of respecting NATO's territory. We have not seen, lashings out into the areas of like Estonia or Latvia. They have been absolutely considerate of Russia, of NATO. We've seen provocation in the air, a Russian aircraft going into airspace, but they have been really, really cautious to make sure that they don't provoke. So you could argue the alliance in itself functions, the deterrent of Article 5 functions.
Well, very interesting piece there, Alex, because, of course, effectively he's saying that NATO has performed, but what has NATO actually done? It's crossed Russia's red line. It's forced Russia to react over the arming, effectively, of Ukraine right on its border. And he's almost claiming that Ukraine is part of NATO and then has been shielded under the NATO umbrella. To me, this is a complete inversion of the real facts around what's happening over the rise of this conflict in Ukraine.
Reading of the Vilnius summit, because as we and others who attempt to be more honest than the mainstream media have been saying, the legacy media, I must get into the habit of saying, there was quite the showdown at the Vilnius summit, as there was 15 years ago at the Bucharest summit, with, in both cases, certain Americans, the realists at the Pentagon, whose men were going to bleed to death in the matter, saying no, together with some Germans. And again, Merkel, then Scholz now saying absolutely not. So you got bilateral agreements with Britain, the Nordics, and others saying to the Ukrainians, we will at least pretend that you're de facto members of NATO. But it is also a vindication of what we were saying 5-6 years ago, when EU military unification pushed by the City of London and Manhattan was something that we were about the only people covering for a while, because we confidently predicted then, but with no glee in it, that there would have to be a war in Ukraine for NATO to find its raison d'etre. And that is now the talking point of the legacy media figures who interview His Majesty's Secretary of State for War. So we seem to have been borne out there.
I would agree with that. Well, we should have another little clip here where he's talking about Ukraine again, but there's one particular statement he makes in this clip which jarred with me. Let's have a listen to this.
There's a rumour there's a reshuffle tomorrow or the day after. Yeah.
In which case, this will be your last hurrah?
In that case, I'll just be over there on the seating with everyone else.
Why did you decide that you'd had enough?
Well, there's a man over there that slightly inspires me to go on your own terms. I think I'd done 4 years. I'd done 3 years as security minister. That's 7 years of 24/7. It hadn't been quiet on my watch. So 2017 terrorist attacks, WannaCry, Salisbury poisoning and security. And then we did the refresh of contest and all that. And then defence has never really stopped. And ultimately, I wasn't going to stand at the next election. I think it's only fair to the sitting Prime Minister that he goes into the next election with a Defence Secretary that's not going to say 6 weeks before I'm off. And I wanted to, sort of go on my terms. And I think it is probably really important for the mental health of myself and my family that you leave on a high.
But given the urgency of Ukraine and the fast unfolding events and your centrality in involvement, were you not tempted to stay on until the general election because it is such a vital job at this moment?
when I was in the army, people used to say there's always another operational tour. You can always stay on for one more operational tour, and one more and one more. And you used to see people basically exhausted, and also, they came to the end like everyone else, and it was sort of, there is no more tour in the end. And I never did anything without thinking about the wider team I have. I have a really good team of civil servants, of military leaders. I've appointed all the chiefs now. Continuity matters. I've appointed new DG, Director Generals in the department, the PUS, nearly all the leadership of defence I've appointed. And, in the end, someone else will take it. I think President Lincoln said the cemetery is full of indispensable men. Ultimately, the momentum is with Ukraine. It doesn't need me. I will always support it. I will do my best. There's lots of other ways to influence it. But I think it's fair to the Prime Minister that as I'm not standing, somebody else takes the role.
Well, there we are. The comment for me that I found really appalling was his quip about the cemetery, because, of course, the cemetery is full of dead Ukrainians, and this is the comment that's never made. So Ben Wallace ramps the war up, he gets the violence going, he encourages Zelensky, and then when the violence is going full tilt, Ukrainian troops being slaughtered in a useless counteroffensive, he simply walks away to supposedly protect his mental health. Alex, just 10 seconds, but I just find this appalling behaviour by this man. He creates the war and then he walks away from it as if nothing's happened.
Correct, but 15, even nearly 20 years ago, one of his predecessors, Jeff Hoon, left the War Office, Defense Ministry of Defense officially, under such a cloud that I was in a meeting once with some mandarins there, and I opened a cupboard expecting to find some tea, and I was warned, don't take those tea bags, they're probably laced with arsenic. So it's been a bit of a history of defense secretaries leaving with mission accomplished, and Wallace certainly has, because he's put all his yes men and yes women in the keep up posts as he was boasting there.
Alex, thank you for reminding us of that point. Let's just have a look at what at Defence HQ has been pushing out in the propaganda. And this, of course, is all part of Ben Wallace's team. Absolute silence on the Russian advances and the fact that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is not only stalled, but the slaughter in men and machines goes on, whilst the West, whether it's NATO or the US or UK, can't provide the ammunition. And the losses for the Ukrainian side at the moment estimated at about another 24,000 killed. And the Ukrainians are not at the first lines of the Russian defence yet. And I'll just carry on with this one, which is that they carry on boasting that the war in Ukraine is now a test bed proxy war. So we can learn out of it, we can enhance our defence industry, all being done on the slaughter of Ukrainians. And I'm just going to move on very quickly through this. If you have a look at the people that Ben Wallace is talking about, this caught my eye. We've got a chief operating officer for the MOD. These are some of their tasks, which are across a huge spectrum. I would suggest more than one person. Well, this is Nina Cope, the lady who's got the job. She joined the mod in June 2022. But if we have a quick look at where she's worked, the National Crime Agency, HS2, if Mike Robinson was alongside me at the moment, he would be saying, what a disaster. And prior to that, she was working in the Met Police. And if we put a bit of focus on this, here are the Met Police embroiled in institutional corruption. Here's the crime agency under fire for not investigating bank fraud. Here's HS2, labelled very clearly as a disaster. And if we get to the Ministry of Defence itself, also a disaster with billions of pounds simply being thrown away. So I'm going to ask whether this is a coincidence or not. I believe that what we've got is the orchestrated breakdown of the Ministry of Defence. And of course, Ben Wallace has been the man in post while that's been happening. Debbie, you've got an extra little bit of clip here, which I really think shows how ridiculous this gentleman, Ben Wallace, is. Shall we have a look at the clip?
Absolutely.
I remember going to see the discarded perfume bottle which was 98% pure. It would have killed 4,000 people if it had been distributed differently. It had just been chucked under a bush in a park. We went to a small park in Salisbury, and I went with the chief constable and the head of terrorism. And he was saying, I'll show you where it is. And there was a man sitting on the bench eating his sandwiches. And these policemen and spooks were pointing at the bench he was sitting on. And he looked up, and I thought, I can't tell him. But I think that is an example of that would have come from the top. And when you see that, someone's making that decision in a NATO country, things had changed, the rules had changed.
I've got no words. Pantomime, Novichok, man sitting on bench. I mean, I don't know what to say. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Brian, but it just was, I couldn't believe he was that unaware that he was being listened to, recorded. And people were laughing.
Debbie, he was sitting there openly mocking the intelligence of the British public, absolutely mocking them. And of course, this incident over the Novichok scam was to help foment the war that we can now see in Ukraine. So an utter disgrace. And that he's grinning from ear to ear is an insult. I think the Ukrainians in our audience should really pay attention to what this man is. But